the first time I went for my motorbike license, I opted in for a 2-day course with Honda motorcycles, and things couldn't have gone better. I mean, I was nervous beforehand, but it became clear over the first day that I had grasped the fundamentals reasonably well, and there were people there who hadn't even ridden a bike before. So day 2 in particular was fun. A day just riding around the lot, practicing different skills and exercises before the afternoon test. I was pretty pumped. So just before the test, the instructor said something to us like, "Okay, I want everyone on their bikes lined up behind the white line ready to go." Something like that. I remember watching him going over to the far side of the lot to gather some witches' hats. So whilst I was waiting for everyone to line up, I decided to hit the throttle and take off across the tarmac. While I was streaming across, I got my balance and I pulled a magnificent mono up on one wheel for a good couple of seconds. One of the few I ever managed. Anyway, I circled around, ready at the back of the queue for my turn. As people were going through, they were managing it pretty easily, and so I was really excited. Once you went through the course, at the finish, you had to ride across to the shed and put the bike away and go into the classroom. So finally, at lucky last, it was my turn. Just the instructor and I. And he came across and he put his hand on the bike. "James, I'm not going to let you take the test today." "What?" "I watched you cross the tarmac before when I asked everyone to line up." "You've got to be kidding me," I said. You're failing me because I pulled a mono?" I was incredulous. "No," he said. "I'm failing you because you couldn't follow my instructions. You didn't now, and you haven't really the last 2 days. If you can't follow instructions here, I can't help but wonder what you will do out on the road. The reason we have rules is to keep you safe." Well, I was fuming in disbelief. He said to me, "Go away, think about it, and come back in a few weeks. You'll have no problems passing." Well, I went away, and I realised that despite my anger at his decision, he was right. I was too reckless. I was too easily distracted, and I would probably get myself killed. Just ask my youngest brother. I managed to total his postie bike. So I didn't come back for another 6 years. Well, today as we look at the beginning of Deuteronomy chapter 4, we're going to see Moses tell the Israelites again and again that obedience to the Torah is the key to life. And our big idea is that obedience to the Torah of Jesus brings fullness of life. Let me say that again, because if you're not religious, that will sound strange. And if you are religious, it will sound even more strange. Obedience to the Torah of Jesus brings fullness of life. Well, Pastor Moses has spent the first 3 chapters of Deuteronomy reminding this current generation of the failure of their parents and the grace of God to them in remembering the promise that he has made to their ancestors, and the grace of God to them personally. And now, in preparing them to go on without him and to take the good land that God is giving them, he begins to unpack the revelation that God had given Israel at Sinai. And in the first 8 verses, his focus is on the grace of Torah. From verse 1, Moses says, "Now," or therefore, in light of what I've just said in chapters 1, 2, and 3, "Israel, hear the decrees and laws that I'm about to teach you. Follow them so that you may live and may go in and take possession of the land the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving you." As we read words like decrees and laws and commands, ordinances and judgments, I think it's worth unpacking what we mean by Torah. And we'll do so in our video series Going Deeper. But for our purposes now, we need to be reminded that at the heart of what Moses is doing is teaching. He's giving instruction. That's what Torah means, to instruct and to teach. He's teaching them the blueprint to a full life. Listen, he says in verse 1. Follow. Why? So you may live. I want us to see three things here from the text about the grace of Torah. That is the grace of God's teaching and instruction to the Israelites. Firstly, God's grace in giving Torah is revealed in his nearness to his people. 2, God's grace in giving Torah is revealed in the clarity that it brings, at what it looks like to have a relationship with God. And thirdly, God's grace in giving Torah is revealed in the forgiveness that it provides. Now to see this, we're going to zoom in on verses 6 to 8. So let's begin at verse 6. Moses says to the people of Israel, observe them, that is the decrees and laws, carefully. For this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear about all these decrees and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. Now most of us, I think, have trouble understanding what Moses says here. I used to feel sorry for the Israelites, chained to the law. I would have written something quite different, something more like, what a tragedy that the Israelites are burdened with the law, if only they could escape it. But we need to understand Moses' statement in light of the context of the environment in which Moses is living. And Moses says that the nations will look on, and they are the ones who will say, wow, I wish we had that. If only our gods would speak to us and reveal to us their will. The trouble is, they don't. And to help us appreciate this, I want to draw your attention to a prayer. It's called a prayer to every god. It comes from ancient Mesopotamia. It was discovered on a tablet which dates from about the mid-7th century BC, but was likely written much earlier. It's very repetitive, so I won't read the whole thing, but I still hope you get the feeling of the frustration of this person. So here it is, a prayer to every god. May the fury of my Lord's heart be quieted toward me. May the God who is not known be quieted toward me. May the goddess who is not known be quieted toward me. May the God whom I know or do not know be quieted toward me. May the goddess whom I know or do not know be quieted toward me. O God whom I know or do not know, my transgressions are great. Great are my sins. O goddess whom I know or do not know, my transgressions are many. Great are my sins. The transgressions I have committed, indeed I do not know. The sin I have done, I do not know. The forbidden thing that I've eaten, I do not know. The prohibited place on which I've set foot, I do not know. But the Lord in the anger of his heart, looked at me. The God in the rage of his heart confronted me. Although I constantly looked for help, no one takes me by the hand. When I weep, they do not come to my side. I utter lament, but no one hears me. I am troubled, I am overwhelmed. I cannot see. I kiss the feet of my goddess. I crawl before you. How long, O my goddess, whom I know or do not know? Will your heart be hostile toward me? The transgressions which I have committed, let the wind carry away. My many misdeeds be stripped off like a garment. O God, whom I know or do not know, my transgressions are 7 times 7. Remove my transgressions. O goddess, whom I know or do not know, my transgressions are 7 times 7. Remove my transgressions. Well, the person who prays this prayer has a serious dilemma. He's got 3 problems in particular. "Oh my God, whom I know or do not know." He doesn't even know which God he's offended. The problem is the gods don't reveal themselves and they don't introduce themselves by name. Second, we hear him pray, "The sin that I have committed, I do not know." And that's a problem. He knows he has sinned, and in that respect, he's more aware than many people in our day. But he doesn't know what the sin is because the gods haven't revealed to him the boundaries of right and wrong behaviour. There's no moral framework. So everything's guesswork. He can't be sure. It's experimental. He doesn't know. And third, did you hear him say this? "I crawl before you, I pray, I kiss your feet." And ultimately, I never know whether it works, whether my offerings are acceptable to the gods. He doesn't know if he's been made clean, if he's been restored into their favour. Now, when we look at the revelation that the Israelites have from their God, and we contrast it with this prayer from ancient Mesopotamia, we begin to understand, don't we, just how privileged the Israelites are. Because for the Israelites, every one of these three questions are answered. "O God, whom I know or do not know." Oh, well, the Lord introduces himself by name. "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." In verses 7 and 8, we read, "What other nation is so great as to have their gods near them, the way that the Lord our God is near us whenever we pray to him?" Verse 8, "What other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws that I am setting before you today?" Well, the answer to these questions, of course, is none. The Israelite nation is incomparably great because it's so closely connected to its God. God is in the midst of his people. The nation is also incomparably great because it's so connected to its Torah. The righteous law is also in the midst of its people. God is near. The grace of the Torah, that is the grace of God's teaching and instruction, is revealed in the nearness to his people that results. It says Patrick Miller, "The righteous laws being written on the heart and being kept are in some sense a manifestation of the presence of God. God draws near in the law that God gives." Well, equally, God's grace in giving Torah is revealed in the clarity that it brings. In contrast to the ambiguity of the prayer to every God, for example, "the sin that I've committed that I do not know," the Lord here reveals his will in brilliant and gracious detail. Israel can see very plainly what actions will enable a flourishing and intimate relationship with their God and what actions will hinder that. Additionally, the statutes and the ordinances given is wisdom. It provides the blueprint for a society that will stand out to the nations. Well, as we go through, we will begin, I think, to see that the more detailed the revelation, the more detailed the law for Israel, the greater the grace, the less that is left to guesswork. Now, I know that can be really hard for us to grasp. I mean, let's be honest. The idea of rules, laws, expectations, or even standards creates anxiety and fear for some of us. Perhaps we hear in them a call to perfection, and so we have a sense of failure before we even start. But that isn't how Moses presents this Torah to the people. These statutes and ordinances actually represent a gracious invitation, an invitation into relationship. These are not simply commands that are issued on high. These are teachings given through patient education to form the character of the people of God. See, the goal of these teachings is to bring life rather than perfection. And finally, God's grace in giving Torah is revealed in the forgiveness that it provides. Do we know what it takes to get rid of the problem of sin? This poor person praying to every god didn't. The surrounding nations don't. But the Israelites do. God revealed a way of forgiveness. He knew that nobody would be perfect, but he says, I have a solution for that. And in the law, in the ordinances and the decrees, he reveals in a very detailed way how one might be forgiven. In Leviticus 4, 5 and 6, when the Lord reveals a whole series of offerings, at the end of each he declares, and they will be forgiven. And they will be forgiven. And they will be forgiven. The context that these laws are presented in helps us to see that faithful obedience, rather than successful achievement, marks the expectation of this relationship between God and his people. Through Moses' voice, God offers the generations that will follow the gracious path of re-entering into the space of an intimate and thriving and flourishing relationship. This, friends, is a brilliant gospel. It's good news. So what does this mean for us? How does this change our lives? Here's how. I want to suggest that the better we see and understand the grace of God in giving the Israelites Torah, the more we see the grace of God in Jesus and in following the Torah, that is the teachings and instructions of Jesus. For those of us who have grown up in the church, we hear the mention of the law and we think of it as something negative, something obsolete, something that needed to be done away with. I hope we can just begin to see that that is not the case. When we begin to see and understand that the Torah given to Israel is actually God's gracious provision, we can see more clearly what it means for Jesus to be the final nearness of God to us. See, God gave Israel Torah in order that Israel might be near to God and the world would see. God sent his son Jesus so that the greatness of God might be seen not in the fortune of a nation, but the life of his son. And the nearness of God would be available not just through a nation, but through his son, expanding beyond national and ethnic boundaries to all people who submit to the universal rule and reign of Jesus. See, Jesus is the culmination of God's gracious provision to the world. It's why Jesus in Matthew 5:17 can say so absolutely, do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. See, what Jesus is saying is that this Torah finds its most perfect and complete expression in him. The Old Testament continually points to this, and the New Testament reveals it. It is through Jesus that we draw near to God. It is the life and teachings of Jesus that bring greatest clarity about how we are to live life in all its fullness and joy. It is through Jesus that we receive forgiveness. Grace upon grace. Here in Deuteronomy, the grace of Torah points us to the grace that is ultimately found in Jesus and lived out through following Jesus. So if you do not know fullness of life, if you've always suspected that there's a God but wondered who that might be, if you feel this day the weight of guilt and shame and regret, then come to Jesus. Follow him. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And to know Jesus, to follow Jesus, to experience his grace and love in this life is to obey him. As the old hymn goes, trust and obey, for there's no other way. To be happy in Jesus is to trust and obey. Or in the words of Jesus himself, if you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I've kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I've told you this so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. If you love Jesus this day, are you obeying him? Are you loving God and loving others? Can you see that Jesus' invitation to follow and obey him is the most gracious and loving invitation there is? Maybe take a moment just now to write down 3 ways that you might love others this week as you follow and obey the gracious Torah of Jesus. And as you do, remember that he is near. He has provided a clear blueprint for life, and you can know freedom from guilt and shame through forgiveness in him. Amen.